Good evening. How are you all doing? Very nice to see a full house once again. Thanks for coming tonight. Today our distinguished speaker is the Ambassador of Ireland, Ambassador Daniel Mulhall. And I would also like to say hello to his wife Greta and to the Consul General Shane Stevens, based in Atlanta. And we have the Irish Honorary Consul here, John Young, based in Charlotte. So we have a complete Irish delegation here tonight. I'm very pleased to see you. My name is Klaus Laus, as you will know by now. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And again, it is sunny today, I'd like to say. Some of you may know that for a long time I actually used to live in Belfast in Northern Ireland. I taught at Queen's University there. My kids are still in Belfast, so I go back regularly. Therefore, the topic of the evening tonight is of great personal interest to me. It is about Ireland, the EU, and Brexit, and what are we going to do now, and what is happening in the future. Daniel Mulhall is the third Irish ambassador who comes to the Krasno event series. It has almost become a tradition, and I would like to see your successor eventually come as well.
In many years' time.
In many years' time. Actually, Michael Collins, the first Irish ambassador who came to see us, he was the very first speaker in our Krasno event series. Daniel is a very distinguished Irish diplomat. He was actually trained as a historian, so you can see studying history is actually not useless. You can, you can do many things. You become even a respected diplomat by studying history. He joined the Foreign Service, the Irish Foreign Service, in 1978. He was first based in New Delhi, in Vienna, and in Brussels, and he became the first Consul General, the first Irish Consul General to Edinburgh in Scotland. And I guess the language problems did not really exist then. Then he was also ambassador to Malaysia, with responsibility for Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. And then for 4 years he became ambassador to Germany. And for another 4 years, recently, he was also then ambassador to the UK. He has been in the United States since last year, since 2017. He also was involved in the negotiations which led to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Daniel is also a keen writer and a published book author. And he is, often appears, he's very much a speaker in demand at book festivals and literary festivals. And not, maybe most importantly, he also has a Twitter account. He tweets regularly. I'm not sure that he can compete, he has as many followers that he can compete with Donald Trump, but he has quite a few followers himself. So please, look for his Twitter account and join it, I guess.
Please, yes, all of you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and a great pleasure to welcome Ambassador Daniel Mulhall. He will talk about Ireland, the EU, and Brexit. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much for those words of welcome. Vielen Dank. It's great to be here, and I've known about this university for a long time, in that I've always been aware of the great American universities, and I've always thought maybe one day I might get to a few of them. I'm actually not doing badly at the moment. I've been to a few, but it's a great privilege to be here, because this is one place that I've always heard about, and its reputation is extremely high all over the world, including in Ireland. And I've seen just the collections that the university has in the Wilson Library. I've seen some material, wonderful Irish material, connected with WBAs. In fact, I'm going to start this talk with a reference to WBAs. Now, I don't normally do that. I do give fairly frequent literary lectures, just because of my own interest, and because also Irish literature travels well, and it tends to have a market, it tends to have an audience for talks about Joyce and Yeats and Beckett and so forth. And I've done that all over the world, including here in the United States. So I often give talks about William Butler Yeats, but I wouldn't normally, in a talk about Brexit, I wouldn't normally be quoting W.B. Yeats. It's not exactly a poetic topic, maybe more soap opera than the subject of a poem. But there's one Yeats poem that actually occurred to me, sort of summarizes in a way what I think about Brexit. Kind of slightly oblique way. You have to kind of use your imagination. But it's a poem called What Then? And it's about W.B. Yeats reflecting back over his life. He wrote this poem in the 1930s when he was towards the end of his life. And he was reflecting back over his life and registering his achievements, which are considerable at that stage. Nobel Prize winner and so forth. But every time he registers an achievement, he hears Plato's ghost ask, what then? So everything he wrote was read. After certain years, he won sufficient money for his need. Friends that have been friends indeed. What then? Sang Plato's ghost. What then? The work is done. Grown old, he thought. According to my boyish plan, let the fools rage. I swerved in naught. Something to perfection brought. But louder sang that ghost. What then? Now, the reason I think about this poem in connection with Brexit is because, a bit like Yeats, I reflect on 45 years of Irish history since we joined the European Union. And I reflect on the progress we've made over that 45 years. And I think when we joined in 1972, Ireland was by far the poorest country of the then 9 members of the European Union. And today Ireland is up there with the wealthiest countries in the European Union, the most successful countries in the European Union on the basis of its per capita income, which is currently, I think, number 2 or 3 in the European Union. So I think about that progress that Ireland has made, but like Yeats, I now wonder, what then? Having made this progress, and by the way, the progress is not just in Ireland's economic fortunes, which have been transformed. It's also our relations with Britain have been transformed to a large extent, or at least partially, through our shared membership of the European Union. So just as we reach a point where we think everything is great, we have a developed economy, it's growing at 5% a year, population is growing again, emigration has stopped, immigration has picked up again, and now 17% of our population in Ireland were born outside of Ireland. Extraordinary figure when you think about it. But what then? That Plato's ghost starts to wonder whether all of that is going to be undermined or unraveled through this Brexit process, which creates particular challenges for Ireland. Let me just give you a little bit of the historical background. As you say, I'm a historian, so I always sort of start. Luckily, I'm not going to go back to the Norman invasion of the 12th century. That's where we often start to complain about our fate. But I won't do that. I'll go back to about 100 years, to 1922. Ireland became independent in 1922. The first 50 years of our independence was successful in the sense that in that period we established a stable parliamentary democracy in which, after a period of war of independence against Britain and then a civil war which divided Ireland very deeply in the 1920s and continued to divide Ireland really for years afterwards, we managed to create a stable democracy, which wasn't something that you could take for granted. Many of the countries that emerged from the First World War and became independent in the period after 1918, by 1939 they had declined into autocracies of various kinds. That never happened in Ireland. Also, we managed to deepen and enlarge our sovereignty. When we first became independent, our independence was curtailed by a number of connections with Britain that Irish nationalists found irksome. We managed to get rid of all of those, and in 1948 we declared a republic, so cutting completely the link with Britain. So that was, politically, the achievement was very good, very strong performance. economically, the country had not really been able to free itself from this kind of dependence on the British market and from being a kind of an agricultural country exclusively devoted to providing food to the larger island with a much greater population. So we tried in the 1950s to open up our economy by encouraging foreign investment, which we previously discouraged, and by encouraging Irish companies to export, to become export-oriented, which again hadn't been a priority for us until that time. But even so, when we joined the European Union, as I said, the average income of an Irish person was about 60% of the European average. Every other country in the European Union was more or less around the average. Some like Italy were a bit below, Britain was about a bit below, Luxembourg was way above, Germany was above, Netherlands, so, but everyone else was more or less the same level of economic development, and we were the stragglers. We were at the back of the pack. The European Union had come into being in the aftermath of the Second World War and was part of a determined effort to repair Europe economically after the ravages of war and to bind its members together so that their interests would be intertwined to the point where conflict between EU member states would become unthinkable. And that is the situation today. So the European Union has been a great peace project and a great prosperity project because, for the most part, Western Europe is among the most developed and prosperous parts of the world, together with the United States. So, in that sense, the partnership between the US and the European Union has been very productive in maintaining living standards and security in both parts of the world, on both sides of the Atlantic. So the EU is a treaty-based body within which its members have freely decided, they've decided freely to pool part of their sovereignty in specific areas in order to use their sovereignty more effectively for the betterment of their people. And that's why it's a bit of a travesty, more than a travesty, to hear the British Foreign Secretary over the weekend compare the European Union with the Soviet Union. I mean, where the man was coming from, don't ask me, but he's been roundly condemned, and I think it's really made a very negative impact all across Europe, especially in those countries who were genuinely under the thumb of the Soviet Union for 50 years in many cases. So we joined the European Union in 1973 alongside the United Kingdom. We joined the same day. UK, Ireland, Denmark joined 1st of January 1973. I think it's safe to say that our attitude towards EU membership has been totally different from the attitude you found in Britain over the last 45 years. For us, EU membership was an opportunity to connect more deeply with our European neighbours and perhaps to get out from under the shadow of the United Kingdom, which had dominated Ireland economically, although it had ceased to do so politically many decades before. And there's long been a political consensus in Ireland that EU membership is a good thing for our country. And of course, when you think about it, having gone from 60% of the European average GDP in 1973 to about 115% now, you can see why people in Ireland would be positively disposed towards the European Union as something that has been an opportunity for us and that has allowed us to achieve some of our national goals. And there's always been very high levels of support for EU membership in Ireland. We've always been at the top of the ladder when it comes to, and Britain's been close to the bottom most of the time. So there's a huge gap in the attitudes towards Europe in Ireland and the attitudes that have prevailed in Britain for a long time. And we have never had, nor do we have today, an anti-European political party. There's simply no party in Ireland that has any idea that Ireland should leave the European Union, or in the way that, for example, in Britain you had the UK Independence Party and you have various right-wing Eurosceptic parties. all across Europe now, but Ireland doesn't have that phenomenon because Irish people tend to be highly supportive of the EU. In fact, support for the European Union has gone up in the last few years since Brexit. People have seen what a mess Brexit is, and it's actually boosted support for the European Union, which is now up around 90%. I mean, 90% support for anything in a democracy is pretty unusual. But in Ireland we have 90% support for the European Union, and among younger people, sort of 30 and under, it's like 97%. So I mean, it's essentially universal support for EU membership. So every time over the last 45 years, whenever there was a question to be asked, do you want to go further in Europe, the Irish answer has always been yes. So for example, in 1979, only 6 years after we joined the European Union, we joined what was called the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, which involved breaking the link with sterling. And for the previous 50, nearly 60 years, the Irish currency had been linked directly to sterling, as part of the sterling area. So it was a brave decision for the Irish government at that time to break a link with sterling and to decide that we wanted to be part of this European currency system. And then, at the time of the Maastricht Treaty, when Britain and Denmark looked for an exemption, an opt-out from European monetary union, economic and monetary union, Ireland did not seek that opt-out, which meant that in 2001 we became one of the founding members of the Eurozone. And clearly we had an economic and financial crisis 10 years ago, which was not unconnected with our European Union membership. But Irish people have not turned away from Europe, even though many people feel that the crisis forced the Irish taxpayer to take responsibility for the banks, which helped to stabilise the European banking system. And there's still a sense of grievance in Ireland about the fact that we were forced to take up, through the taxpayer, the burden of refinancing and saving our banks, which were part of the European banking system. But nonetheless, there hasn't been any diminution, despite that, in Irish public support for EU membership. Ireland has bounced back from that crisis, and we've had the fastest growing economy in the European Union for the past 4 years, and we are expected to do the same again this year. Unemployment has come down from 15% down to around 5% now, so we're heading towards what we would regard as full employment. Somewhere between 4 and 5% would be regarded as full employment in Ireland. And also employment is increasing all the time. People are coming into the country, Irish people are moving back. So the country is in very good economic health. So a bit like Yates, you know, we've kind of made sufficient money for our needs, and that's why the what then question bothers us. Is this all going to be undermined by developments in the world, the outside world, for which we have no responsibility and over which we can't exercise any control? Brexit, but also in the American case, the possibility of a trade war developing between Europe and the United States would be very dangerous from an Irish point of view. So there are clouds on the horizon, the Brexit cloud, and also the possibility of trade disputes between Europe and North America escalating into something that would cause problems for the Irish economy. Now, EU membership has also been beneficial for British-Irish relations. Right? We didn't join the European Union in order to become closer to Britain. That wasn't part of the... But actually we joined because at that time we had almost no alternative, because 70% of our exports went to Britain. So when they joined the EU, more or less, Ireland had to join too. But having said that, and remember when we joined, the two governments were not exactly on the same page, because we joined in '73, which was only 4 years after the Troubles had broken out in Northern Ireland. There was violence and people were being killed in Northern Ireland. British troops, after all, were involved in Bloody Sunday, where 13 unarmed demonstrators were killed in Derry. So things were pretty rough at that time when we joined the EU. But the two countries, we never brought our old historical argument into the European meeting rooms. We kept it outside, we kept it separate. But actually, EU membership had a good effect. Because, let's say, today would be an average day in Brussels. And there are probably 30 odd meetings taking place in the European Union meeting rooms in Brussels. And those are dealing with all sorts of issues, transport issues, environment, energy, foreign policy, you know, across the board. At each one of those meetings, there's an Irish delegation and a British delegation. And because they speak the same language, they're interested in a lot of the same things, they naturally build up friendships and alliances. And that's been happening for the last 45 years. So we've come to realize that we have a lot more in common with the British than perhaps we thought we had before we joined the EU. So he's actually brought the two countries closer and closer together. And the economic relationship has also matured. When we first joined, basically Ireland was part of the breadbasket for the UK. We produced a lot of beef and the butter and the milk and so on that went into British households and was consumed in Britain. And now, of course, it's much more of a two-way connection. There's a lot of Irish companies who are buying stuff from Britain, and there's a very mature relationship now. It's not just in, you know, in food stuff, but across the board. So the economic relationship has become much more mature and much more of a two-way relationship with both countries benefiting, because Ireland's the 5th largest market for British exports, even though we have a population of only less than 5 million. So the relationship is quite cooperative, quite close economically. And then, politically, the two countries have worked on the peace process. Remember, between 1969 and 1994, 3,500 people lost their lives in Northern Ireland. That's 3,500 people in a place with a population of 1.5 million or thereabouts. That's a pretty shocking number. So the two governments really came together. I don't think they'd been able to come together in the way they did had they not been members of the European Union together for the previous 20-odd years. And they came together and they managed, with the help of our American friends, Senator George Mitchell from Maine in particular, and Bill Clinton, President Reagan, Tip O'Neill, Ted Kennedy, they all really weighed in and were very helpful in getting us to, in pushing the parties to make that final agreement, which has saved probably thousands of lives, because the last 20 years hardly anybody has lost their lives in Northern Ireland. So you have a period of 20 years when there's been no deaths, almost no deaths, one or two, which are essentially just, you know, small incidents, well, incidents, not terrible things, but isolated incidents, whereas the previous 20 years, probably 2,500 people lost their lives. So, transformation. And the two governments can take a lot of credit for that, and they have become co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, which was signed in 1998, which has brought peace to Northern Ireland. And then in 2011 and 2014, we had the first ever exchange of state visits. Imagine that. For 90 years, independent Ireland did not welcome a state visit from the head of state of our neighbouring island. And likewise, the Irish president couldn't go on a state visit to the UK, although presidents did visit the UK frequently. So there was a kind of it took a long time. But eventually, in 2011, Queen Elizabeth visited Ireland and was very well received, and it went down extremely well. She spoke a few words of Gaelic when she addressed the state dinner at Dublin Castle. She was, you know, she did all the right things. She went to our Independence Monument in Dublin and she bowed her head to pay respects to those people who had fought against her grandparents, after all, to try and drive her grandparents out of Ireland as King and Queen of Ireland. And then in 2014, when I was ambassador in London, Peter and I had the privilege of spending 3 nights at Windsor Castle with the President as guests of the Queen, and it was a wonderful occasion which we'll never forget. And then, around the same time, we were dealing with centenaries, and you know the way anniversaries can be troublesome, and, you know, in different places around the world. In Ireland, they can be troublesome too, naturally. And we were dealing with the 100th anniversary of the First World War, when Irish people fought in the British Army and died in significant numbers. But some people in Ireland historically thought that those people were duped into fighting for Britain and should never have fought for Britain, should have been at home fighting for Ireland. And then 2 years later we had the centenary of the Easter Rising, which was the rebellion in Dublin, which started our independence struggle, and which was the subject of W.B. Yeats' great poem, Easter 1916, which literary scholars and students will be aware of, I would know about. So we navigated all of that, you know, tricky stuff. I remember having to deal with this in the UK when I was ambassador, and on a few occasions I laid a wreath at a First World War memorial in the morning and went to a 1916 commemoration that evening with the Irish community. So it was an interesting balancing act, because what we wanted to do was we wanted to celebrate and commemorate our own national struggle, but without creating difficulties or stirring up trouble. There were fears that maybe the Easter Rising centenary might have stirred up passions that might have become rather ugly. It never happened. It was a celebration, but it was respectful, and people were not driven to flights of political passion. They admired the sacrifice of those who had fought for Ireland at that time, but they weren't driven to want to march and take sort of, you know, go into kind of political ecstasies about the issue. You know, they dealt with it in a cooler fashion, a mature fashion, I think. And that always worked very well. And in fairness, people in Britain also recognised that the 1916 commemorations had not been anti-British. They had been Irish celebrations of Ireland rather than anti-British occasions. And the British media gave the events in Dublin a respectful coverage, extensive coverage, in fact, and was all respectful. A few exceptions. You always get exceptions to these rules. So that takes us up to the summer of 2016. So I think if you were Yeats looking back over Ireland, you'd say, "Well, it's great. I've done all these things. We're at peace with Britain. Our economy is recovered. We're embedded in the European Union. We're facing the future with confidence. We're highly educated, prosperous, outward-looking, tolerant people. Fantastic." Then in June of 2016, the British decided to leave the European Union by a referendum. Now, it was probably always going to be an uphill battle to win a referendum on EU membership in a country where the media has spent the previous 40 years pilloring the EU and writing sort of stories that weren't particularly based on facts, but who needs facts when you can make things up? So there was a lot of highly unfair, kind of tabloid condemnation of all things European. So naturally, British people were not particularly fond of the European Union, and they were kind of maybe reluctant. They kind of didn't. They weren't opposed to it, but they'd been fed a diet of skepticism about the European Union. And the campaign in favour of leaving the European Union was anchored in a set of claims that proved to be very effective, even if their veracity was dubious. One campaign slogan was that leaving the EU would enable the UK to, quote, take back control. I always asked them, well, what exactly have you lost control of? Because after all, we in Ireland and Britain as well, as EU members, we retain control of all the things that really matter to most people. Defence, foreign policy, social welfare, education, health, justice, taxation, all of those things are exclusively for national decision, or almost exclusively for national decision. The EU is essentially about managing the single market, its regulations to control the free movement of goods around the single market, to the benefit of the countries concerned. Sadly, the issue of the Northern Ireland border never featured in the referendum campaign. It just didn't feature. Those on the Leave side were out and said, nothing will happen, Northern Ireland will be changed, nothing will happen, don't worry about it. So Northern Ireland was kind of relegated really to a very minor issue that hardly ever featured in the campaign. I tried to point out in my various public appearances and TV and radio interviews that there was a risk that if you leave a union that bound Ireland and the UK together for 45 years, you're taking a risk, especially with Northern Ireland. But that didn't really count for very much, because people were more concerned about the UK contribution to the EU budget And immigration, the issue of immigration was used very effectively by the opponents of EU membership to undermine public support for EU membership. Now, more than 2 years have elapsed since the UK's referendum of June 2016. And now, you might say that if you have a referendum, it's clear, the decision is clear. It's 52 to 48, job done, not a bit of it. Because of course, a referendum differs from an election. In an election, you elect a president or a parliament. And the one who wins the election decides what the election victory means for their government. And in a parliamentary system, the majority in parliament decides how to interpret the will of the people expressed through the election. In a referendum, it's never as clear as that. You never know quite what people voted for. They voted to leave the European Union. But what's become clear over the past 2 years is that that's not a simple proposition. It's a complex issue. Because what you're trying to do in leaving the European Union is unraveling, pulling apart 45 years of interlocking public policy across the board. And it's a very complicated thing to do. And then to put things in place of those arrangements, which have evolved over 45 years, is also a very difficult thing to do. And the problem is that there is complete division in Britain about what that referendum result meant. And the British government has struggled to define precisely what they mean by leaving the European Union and what kind of future relationship they desire to have with the European Union as a non-member of the Union. Now, the negotiations on Britain's departure from the EU are in 2 parts. The first part is the divorce settlement, where you have to agree the terms of your divorce. And then the second part is where you agree the future relationship. At the moment, we're still in part 1, and that's 2 years since the referendum. We still haven't managed to agree what's supposed to be the easy part, because the divorce settlement involves 3 things. It involves agreeing on the rights of European citizens living in the UK and UK citizens living in Europe. What rights will they have after Britain leaves? And that's been negotiated over the last 2 years. The second issue is the financial settlement, because Britain has agreed over the years to make payments into the budget to cover certain things. And the EU's position is that you have to abide by those commitments. You can't just walk away and say we're going to pay the bills that we agreed to pay 4, 5, 6 years ago when we were members of the EU. And Britain has now agreed, broadly speaking, to pay 40 billion euros into the European Union account in order to cover the liabilities that they have taken on over the last number of years. And the third issue is Ireland, the Irish border. The position about the Irish border is that it's become a major stumbling block. Nobody thought about this. As I said to you earlier, during the referendum campaign, the view was that everything will be fine. No change in the border. Nothing will happen. No problem. That's proven to be a rather spurious claim, because at the moment, at least, it looks as if the Irish border is the principal stumbling block in the negotiations between the EU and the UK. And remember, this is not a negotiation between Britain and Ireland. It's a negotiation between the EU and the UK. We're part of the EU side of the table. But the EU countries have been very supportive of Ireland's position. What is our position? In a nutshell, it is that we believe the current open border in Ireland, no controls whatsoever, just go back and forth across the border, no controls, that has to continue in place. We cannot afford to have any border controls on the island of Ireland, because the open border is part of the dividend of the peace process. And if you remove that open border, you're removing part of the infrastructure of the framework that keeps the peace process together. Our European partners agree with that. They say yes, We cannot allow a border to develop on the island of Ireland. And they say EU is prepared to treat Northern Ireland separately, to treat it as if it were still a member of the EU, even though it's not. There's a big concession to Northern Ireland. Our position, therefore, is that we need guarantees that whatever happens, there won't be a border on the island of Ireland. And by the way, the British government agrees with this. They say, yes, we will make sure there will never be a border on the island of Ireland. But they say they will do this by having an EU-UK agreement for the future that will remove the need for any borders between the UK and the European Union. Therefore, no border in Ireland will be required. We say we would love that. It would be great. But what if that doesn't work out? We need a fail-safe backstop. And the British have agreed there should be a backstop agreement to guarantee that if all those other things fail to happen, they will ensure that there's no border on the island of Ireland. We want that in writing. We wanted that in a legally binding agreement. And the wording of that agreement is causing major problems between the UK and the European Union, with Ireland on the EU side, basically saying we cannot agree to moving on to the second stage of the negotiations on Brexit without getting satisfaction on a backstop agreement that gives us legal certainty that whatever happens, there won't be a border on the island of Ireland. Many people in Britain are saying, well, that would mean actually a border in the Irish Sea. That would mean dividing Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. We say, no, it wouldn't. We've no intention of having a border on the Irish Sea, but there'll have to be some kind of arrangements to make sure that the open border in Ireland does not mean that goods from Britain can come freely into the European Union without meeting the standards that European Union producers have to meet in order to sell their goods around Europe. And that's a major stumbling block. When we move on to the second stage of the negotiations, which is all about the future relationship, at that stage, we will want the closest possible relationship between the UK and the European Union. Because the UK is our biggest European trading partner. About 15% of Irish exports go to the UK. About 15% come to the United States. So it's about the same value to us as the US market. We want to keep those exports in place. We don't want to see our exports to the UK affected by blockages in the trading relationship between the UK and the European Union. But of course we have to get to that stage, and the risk is that because of the current political atmosphere in the UK surrounding Brexit, there is a risk that the whole negotiating process between the UK and the EU might collapse, and that will lead to a chaotic situation whereby there'd be no rules and no one knows what would happen then. There'd be chaos. My hope is that the need to avoid a chaotic outcome will encourage both sides to find pragmatic, sensible solutions. But sadly, you can't be certain that good sense will prevail. Someone said the problem with common sense is not always that common. but it makes sense for a pragmatic solution to be found that doesn't end up in disrupting the entire European economy. So we have a major stake in the future of the EU-UK relationship. Of all the member states, Ireland is probably the one with the most intensive set of ties to the UK. We're the only EU country with a land border with the UK. It is our nearest neighbour with which we've had traditionally close commercial engagement. We're now far less reliant on the British market than we once were, but it remains our biggest market, and Britain is especially important for Irish-owned firms, 40% of whose exports go to the UK. Any disruption in the flow of trade between the UK and Ireland would be very damaging from an Irish point of view. Very damaging for Britain as well, by the way, but we have to look at our own interests. So we would be a strong advocate of keeping the UK as close as possible. Membership in all but name would be ideal from an Irish point of view. But the problem is the UK cannot expect to have all the benefits of EU membership without taking on the responsibilities. So it's a question of striking a balance between benefits on the one hand and responsibilities on the other. Not being a member of the European Union has consequences. And that doesn't mean that anyone in the EU is trying to punish Britain, but that if you're not a member of an organisation, you can't expect to have all the benefits of membership. So, I come back to Jens's question. What then? What now? Where are we going here? The UK's departure from the EU is a deeply unwelcome development for Ireland. Although there'll be some upsides for us. For example, I saw today the Central Bank of Ireland announced that more than 100 financial services companies are negotiating with the Central Bank of Ireland in order to be allowed to be approved, be given a license to operate their business in Ireland. And that means they're thinking about moving from Britain to Ireland in order to be able to service the European market from Dublin. So that's going to be a plus side. Also, future American businesses looking to establish in Europe will probably look more favourably on Ireland because an English-speaking country, it'll now be the only English-speaking country within the European Union. So, but still, overall, even though there will be some upsides, overall, it will be bad for Ireland not to have our nearest neighbour as part of the club to which we continue to belong in the period ahead. So, Brexit-related uncertainties are placing an unfortunate cloud on the horizon. It's unfortunate also for the European Union because it's not as if we're losing a big member at a time when the Union is kind of in bouncing, robust good health. The European Union is going through a period of difficulty, mainly because of the after effects of the Great Recession, which has caused anti-European sentiment to rise in Ireland. And also, of course, the issue of immigration, of migration, has become a very vexed issue for many European countries. Not in Ireland, because we're an offshore island, but for those countries that see their borders being fairly open and people coming in and creating difficulties. In Germany, for example, Chancellor Merkel's popularity has plummeted, and a right-wing organisation which had very little support when I was there only 6 years ago, has now become a major political party with quite a right-wing political agenda, anti-immigrant and so forth. So the EU is in difficulties with a number of countries in Eastern Europe who've elected governments that are not exactly in keeping with the norms of the European Union historically. So it's a difficulty for the European Union to lose one of its most powerful members at a time when the Union itself is undergoing difficulty. My assumption is that the EU will respond to this challenge of losing a big member state like Britain by trying to renew the European Union, by trying to find ways of moving forward with the project of European integration. But that's not easy to achieve because you have to get agreement from all 27 member states, no easy prospect, and then you've got to get approval from the parliaments of all 27 countries, and you may have to have a referendum in certain countries such as Ireland. So moving ahead to the next stage of European integration is a likely outcome, but it's not one that is that easy to manage because of the uncertainties around the negotiation of a new agreement and the ratification of that agreement. It's also deeply ironic that Britain should decide to leave the European Union and abandon its partnership with Ireland at a time when things have never been better between the UK and Ireland. And sadly, since I left a year ago, you know, the atmosphere between Britain and Ireland has kind of gone downhill a bit. Nothing to do with me, nothing to do with my successor, just one of those things. But now, you know, the British tabloid media are blaming Ireland, saying that Ireland's trying to, you know, to abuse its position within the EU, make life difficult for Britain. Not at all. We want to make life easy for Britain because we want Britain to remain as closely allied as possible. But we can't jeopardise the Northern Ireland peace process in order to satisfy the British tabloid media. So again there I think we will redouble our efforts after Brexit to mend our relationship with the UK and to keep ourselves closely connected with the UK. And it has been agreed, for example, that the old relationship between the UK and Ireland will continue. In other words, that Irish people can move freely to Britain, can settle there, can vote, can access social welfare, healthcare, education, as if they were British citizens. And British citizens do the same in Ireland. So that's going to continue, even though other Europeans will not have the same opportunities in future. And British people will not have the same opportunities in other EU countries. So we are maintaining a special relationship with the UK. And I'm convinced that at the political level we will have to redouble our efforts to make sure that we don't lose our links with Britain, because you can come to terms with your history, but you can't do much about your geography. So we'll always have Britain as a major partner, and we're going to have to work harder, because our diplomats won't be meeting around the same table in Brussels from now on every day, building up links. We have to make a special effort to make sure we don't drift apart. And sadly, Brexit will damage Britain, and that's bad for us, because for us, the best environment for Ireland is when the UK is doing well, the EU is doing well, the rest of the EU is doing well, and the United States is doing well. If all three of those are doing badly, it's disastrous for Ireland, because we're an export-oriented economy. If two of the three are doing well, that's great. If one of the three are doing well and the other two are doing badly, not so good. So we do rely on Britain continuing to have a successful economy, because we benefit so much from our relationship with them. One thing is clear for Ireland, that we have committed ourselves to EU membership. There's no question about Ireland following the UK out of the European Union. But we know that the European Union will be a different union without the UK, because it'll tip the balance somewhat away from the northern European countries who tend to be free trade oriented, light regulation, towards the southern countries that tend to have a different outlook on EU affairs. So we'll have to get used to a new reality of a post-Brexit world in which our nearest neighbour will no longer be a member of the European Union, will no longer be sharing that European journey with us. But having come through the economic crisis of 2008, 9, 10, when our economy fell off a cliff, I'm convinced that we will be able to manage whatever challenges Brexit and US trade policy, which is going in certain directions which we don't care for. But we're very happy that President Trump and President Juncker from the Commission in July came together and issued a statement which has set in train a new negotiation between the EU and the US designed to resolve the trading difficulties and hopefully put the transatlantic economic relationship back on an even keel. But you still have to ask the question, what then?
Thank you very much for a very interesting and stimulating talk, but you were calling for a pragmatic solution. I think we all would agree with that. But 5 months to go, so what's the likelihood of a pragmatic solution in the remaining 5 months?
Well, I'm always a glass half full rather than a glass half empty person, whether it's wine or Guinness or whiskey, which is more popular than ever in the United States these days. So I take the view, but from 40 years of experience, that the European Union has a great capacity for finding compromises and accommodations. So my continued hope, expectation, though I can't be overconfident about it, because there is a risk of the whole thing falling apart, my assumption is that sometime in November or December, late at night, probably 4 or 5 in the morning, the leaders will emerge bleary-eyed and say, we have an agreement. That would be the normal way of resolving crisis in Europe. The problem is that that requires political will. And the difficulty that we see at present is that the Brexit issue is so toxic in Britain. By the way, most European countries shrug their shoulders and say, well, Brexit. We are obsessed with it because we know how important it is to Ireland. But for the French and the Germans I think are interested because they don't want to see bad relationship developing between Britain and the EU, which could happen. But for a lot of countries in further afield, their interest, their trade with Britain is probably fairly modest and it doesn't really bother them too much. But in Britain, it's toxic. You've got two diametrically opposed elements, the pro-European element and the doggedly anti-European element. And unfortunately, the British government has been unable to find a steady course. Now, they have a course, but whether they can adhere to it or not is another matter. Because the most recent British proposal, which was agreed by the British government some months ago and put forward as the British government's new position on, we thought was not a solution, but at least a good effort at moving the things forward and a basis for negotiations. But that was immediately disowned by two cabinet ministers who resigned, and since then they've been running a vicious campaign against the so-called Chequers Agreement. So when you have toxic politics, rational, pragmatic solutions sometimes get pushed aside. But I'm still of the view that there's enough pragmatism in Britain to ensure that the extremists, the wilder Brexiteers don't get their way and don't dominate British policy.
Wouldn't pragmatism dictate you should have a second referendum?
Well, that's entirely up to them. I've never been a believer in a second referendum because I say, look, the key thing is to get a solution to the future relationship that keeps Britain closely connected to the EU. A second referendum might happen, who knows. There's a growing movement now in favour of it, but I still think it's some way short of what would be required in order to have that referendum take place. You need an election in Britain with one of the parties to go into the election promising a second referendum, and if they won the election, then that would be a mandate for a second referendum. But if that doesn't happen, then I don't see it happening before March of next year, which is supposed to be the date when Britain leaves the European Union.
Okay, thank you. Let's assume there is no deal. That first stage cannot be resolved, that the British decide the WTO rules will have to be applied rather than special rules. What, in your view, would be the outcomes? How could that be worked with, both regarding trade and regarding the Northern Irish question?
Well, I mean, regarding trade, it wouldn't be ideal. Obviously, there would be a very disruptive period while both economies got used to the new arrangements, and there would be disruptions on borders and so on. I think in Northern Ireland, you'd have to treat it separately, and I think that European Union member states do recognise that Northern Ireland is a special case. I mean, all you've got to do is point to the fact that it's the only land border between the UK and another EU member state, and the fact that it's connected with the peace process that remains fragile, although it's delivered 20 years of peace. So I don't think anybody in Europe would want to disrupt things on the island of Ireland. And I would, even in that scenario, I'd be hopeful that we could get a special set of arrangements agreed between North and South Ireland. But it wouldn't be ideal, and nobody should be contemplating that kind of outcome, because it would be very, very disruptive. And not just for Ireland, for Britain as well. Imagine, Britain is not even self-sufficient in foodstuffs. So now the British government is now talking about, hoarding food and rationing. I mean, it's complete nonsense. I mean, the problem is that the European Union, as it currently stands, that's the way the modern world works, with no checks, free flow of goods and services. That's what the EU has made possible. And to try and walk away from that, and to pretend that sovereignty is more important than the pragmatic value of having a free flow of goods across the Channel and around Europe, is a sad reflection on the way the political debate was allowed to go in Britain prior to the last referendum.
Thank you. Let's open it up. This gentleman, please. No, the one next to you. Can I have a microphone?
If they had a second referendum, how do you think it would go?
Well, I don't know. I mean, in that everyone thought that the referendum would be a remain. I mean, even the night of the referendum, I was at a function, and the then Chancellor told me that yes, the exit polls were pointing to a narrow remain result. So the opinion polls got it wrong. It's happened here as well, I think, in the not-too-distant past. So, you know, obviously, at the moment, I mean, some polls suggest that there's been a shift in opinion, but it hasn't been a dramatic shift. There hasn't been much of a shift, really. I would say that you get two responses from the public. You get the irritation factor of, you know, we voted once, why are we voting again, and that might just galvanize some people to vote leave. Nonetheless, there would be people who would be aware of the chaos that's been created and the potential for further chaos who might be more willing to vote Remain. So I think, sadly, I think it would be tight again. My sense is that it would probably be a Remain vote, but it might only be a narrow Remain vote. And really, to sort this thing out, you'd probably, ideally, you'd want a sort of a very substantial majority second time round that you could kind of then rinse the whole thing out of the system, because I just feel another referendum would be very divisive. It would be very nasty, and I'm glad I wouldn't be the ambassador in Britain at that time. Yeah.
But you said at the outset there were three major things. One was the Northern Ireland border, and you said that was never considered.
Yeah, never considered, no.
And
or rarely considered.
Yeah, wasn't much considered, and now it's the main thing.
Yes, but I still think that if you had a second referendum, Northern Ireland might be slightly higher up the food chain in terms of an issue on the agenda for the referendum, but I don't think it would be a major issue, because I think British people don't tend to see Northern Ireland as the kind of priority that we would see it as. We're always more obsessed because it's on our island and it affects us more directly than it affects them. So I wouldn't be confident that Northern Ireland would be a deciding factor. I think more likely people would be swayed by the fact that they've seen how much difficulty this whole Brexit business entails, and that might put them off and make them, you know, encourage them to vote Remain. But I think there'd be also people who voted Remain last time would say, well, we voted last time, but we really need to assert ourselves. So I'm not sure it would be a decisive victory. I think it probably would be a Remain, you know, result this time around, but you wouldn't want to be too confident about it.
Thank you. The gentleman at the end here.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Earlier you spoke on the EU binds its members through mutual interests, one of those being security. How would the security of Europe change with Brexit, and do you think it could affect an organization such as NATO?
Well, I think what I said was that defence is a matter for national decision. There is no European army, for example. Now there's European cooperation in defence, but it's very definitely more the voluntary kind. It's not like NATO. There's no commitment in the European treaties to go to war if one of the EU member states is attacked. That's a NATO feature. But I do think that the way the world is developing at the moment, the argument or the debate about European defence is definitely becoming more pressing. You know, look at what's happened in Europe. You've had Russia becoming much more assertive in Ukraine and taking over Crimea. So, you know, there's obviously a certain risk there. On the other hand, the United States maybe doesn't seem to be quite so devoted to the transatlantic alliance, to NATO, as it maybe once was. There are certain people here, certain thoughts here that are more skeptical maybe about NATO. And also there's just the general feeling that in Europe's general hinterland, you know, there's problems in Syria and North Africa, and you know that there might need to be some more vigorous European measures for common defence. That would be very, very difficult to agree, it seems to me. But I do think that the debate that will occur in Europe after Brexit will be a debate that will focus, at least in part, on issues of security and defence. But my own belief is that it will be an incremental thing. It will be a slow evolution of European security policy, but that NATO will continue to be seen by most Europeans. We're not members of NATO, of course, but by most Europeans will continue to see NATO as the main guarantee of European security. I just hope that that continues to be the view also on this side of the Atlantic.
So do we. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, Brexit has become...
Just wait for the microphone, which is rushing to you. There you are.
Well, Brexit seems to have become a politicized topic in this country as well, not only because the previous president went to London and lobbied for the Remain campaign, but mainly because the current president went to Scotland when he was a candidate and lobbied for the Brexit campaign on the UKIP side. Now you, as the ambassador to the United States, how do you circumnavigate these troubled waters that the current administration is actually arguing the opposite of what you have been arguing here tonight?
Well, I maybe correct that slightly. I think the president was visiting Scotland the day after, when the result was becoming always known, and he said, "I saw it coming," and so on. But I don't think he. And I suppose he. No, I think he did say things.
The other side of it.
I think he did say things during his long campaign for the presidency that suggested that he was partial to the idea of Brexit, and he had some connections with Nigel Farage, leader of the UK Independence Party. So I suppose you could say that maybe he was more partial to Brexit. I haven't actually detected within the administration any great enthusiasm for Brexit. I think most people recognise that it's not a good thing for the transatlantic alliance, because Britain, after all, is the United States, one of its key allies, and for them to be leaving the EU is probably not in America's interest. So I do think that Americans worry about the geostrategic disruptions caused by the Brexit issue. If there's one person in Europe who probably enjoyed that referendum result, it's probably Vladimir Putin, who probably thought this is a great thing because it weakens Western Europe, removes one of the most powerful countries from the European Union. So in that sense, strategically, it's a bad day's work. As I said, I think this is a bad thing. There's hardly any winners in this thing. It's bad for Britain, bad for Ireland, bad for the European Union, bad, I think, for the Western world generally. That one of the key cornerstones of transatlantic frameworks is now being weakened by the removal from it of one of its important member states.
Thank you. Students and ladies are also allowed to ask questions. Yeah, here.
Hi. I was wondering if you have any views on the kind of anti-immigration sentiment in the UK that kind of prompted Brexit compared to that in the US kind of in the election with Donald Trump. If you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, what I can say is that in Ireland, we have no anti-immigration sentiment, even though, as I said, 1 in 6 people now living in Ireland were born outside the state. So 17% of our population was born outside of Ireland. And that makes us gives us one of the highest percentages of immigrants in any population, in any country in Europe, higher than the United States, for example. And that hasn't had the kind of effect that it's had here in the United States, or indeed in Britain, or indeed in Germany. And elsewhere in Europe, where immigration has become a major bone of contention. And it has given space to anti-European, anti-immigrant parties to become much more powerful than they would have been 10, 20 years ago. I think it's the European Union, and this is how everything got a bit mangled during the referendum debate, because I suspect that most British people who voted to leave because of immigration were not worried about Poles or Lithuanians or Latvians, but it was people from further afield. The European Union has nothing to do with that. In other words, Britain, as a member of the EU, can't prevent European Union citizens from coming to Britain and working there and living there and so on. But it can prevent people from other parts of the world coming in. But I think that in the public mind, immigration was all wrapped up together, and it was Europeans and non-Europeans and so on. And it's the non-Europeans that I suspect were the main kind of concern for people. But they saw the EU as somehow responsible for more immigration into Britain, and therefore voted leave as a result. And also there was this pretty notorious ad that the Leave campaign ran, which made the point that Turkey is about to join the European Union, and 85 million Turks could suddenly decide to move to Britain. Now there are two problems with that particular narrative. The first is that Turkey is nowhere near joining the EU. It's probably like, we're talking about, it may never join the EU, and it will probably only join the EU when Turkey has become a kind of a more developed country, so the gap between Turkey and the rest of the Union is more limited, and therefore, you know, immigration would not be an issue very much. But it was total nonsense to believe that. But there were sort of, you know, EU means migrants streaming in. I remember talking to a very pro-European member of Parliament from North Wales, who said that despite him being the most pro-European parliamentarian in the whole of the UK, his electorate voted 70-30, 65-35 for leave. I said, why? Why was that? He said, they were worried about immigration. I said, but do you have any immigration? He said, no. He said, because they all say they're coming. But the problem with migration is that it is possible to stir up people's fears, even though there may be nobody currently immigrating to that particular part of Wales or whatever. But it's the fear that somehow there's a flood of people about to come in, and you can stop them by voting to leave the European Union, which is again a nonsense, because my own view is that immigration into Britain will not change much at all, for the very fact that Britain needs the people. I mean, I have good connections with the construction companies in Britain, because most of them were founded by Irish people 40, 50, 30 years ago, and they're still run by, they have Irish managements. And I asked them, what percentage of your workers today come from Eastern Europe? The answer was between 50 and 70%. If those people didn't come in to the UK, the economy would collapse, because they wouldn't be able to find people to do those jobs. So, on all sorts of grounds, the immigration issue was abused. But I think it's not uncommon for politicians around the world to stir up fears about the foreigner. Happily in Ireland, people do not seem to be willing to buy that one. And that's mainly because the Irish still think of themselves as a nation of immigrants. And they know that their people were immigrants in the United States and Australia and Britain and so on. And when they first arrived, they were regarded as an inferior race. I knew people in London, older Irish, mainly women, who told me they remember seeing signs on boarding houses in Britain saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, right? The Irish were seen in Britain at that time as a sort of an inferior race. It's complete nonsense, of course, but I mean, today, of course, Irish people basically run Britain because of highly educated Irish people go over there and are now sort of running all the top companies in Britain. Not all of them, but so the point I make is that but that means that Irish people have a kind of something in the back of their head that says, we're not going to go down, or we're not going to blame the foreigner for our troubles. Irish people blame a lot of people for, you can imagine the crisis of 10 years ago. There's a long list of people to blame. There's bankers, there's the government for not controlling the banks, there's the regulator for being asleep on the job, there's the central bank, the European Commission for not, controlling things more, the European Central Bank. You never see anybody in Ireland blaming immigrants for the problems that we had 10 years ago. And I hope that will continue to be the case, but I'm not being complacent, because obviously we're not uniquely virtuous, but there is something in the Irish psyche that thinks of ourselves as a nation that were immigrants all over the world, and we don't want to repeat the mistakes that other countries made when they received the Irish 100 years ago, or more or less.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If there were to be some sort of hard border again, at least temporarily, do you think that would be the end of the peace process, or has the peace process become solid enough to survive that?
Well, I would never say that it will be the end of the peace process, because the two governments would have to redouble their efforts to ensure that whatever happened, there wouldn't be, the peace process would survive. So, but it would require a lot of effort, and there's a risk there. All I'm saying is that the open border is part of the fabric of the peace process, or it's part of the infrastructure, it's part of the framework that supports the peace process. If you remove that, you remove one of the supports from the peace process, and you weaken the process as a result. So I'd never say it would be the end of the peace process, but certainly it would be a major challenge, and it would require the governments to act very swiftly and very nimbly.
So you could see violence again?
No, I would never say that. I don't believe that will happen. But I'm just saying that the peace process is a process, and if you move things backwards, you're kind of undermining the process, and you're hoping a risk, not an immediate risk, but a risk for the future.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman over there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm just following up on this. When whatever happens in March, how do you think the other jurisdictions of the United Kingdom that have devolved powers, what will happen depending on whatever is decided upon with the discourse that's happening, where there are certain types of nationalism that aren't based on a fear of foreigners, it's based on a civic nationalism of the need for immigrants, the need for development, the need for moving an economy forward and seeing a relationship with the European Union. And your own experience in Edinburgh, I'm just curious to see how you think this might play out. And the fact that Northern Ireland itself voted majority to remain.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, in Northern Ireland, clearly Brexit has stirred things up quite a bit. It's added another bit of stirring to a pot that was already, you know, a bit unstable. Probably the support for United Ireland has increased in Northern Ireland over the last few years since the Brexit referendum, but it's still not a majority, so I don't think there's going to be any change, any constitutional change in the near future. But certainly the issue has become more active, more of an issue, because the numbers who express themselves in support of United Ireland have gone up somewhat. In the rest of the UK, I mean, clearly Scotland is the main concern for the UK government, and the Scots will be very vigilant and will whatever Northern Ireland gets, no doubt Scotland will want something along the same lines. But it's much more difficult because, you know, I mean, at least in the case of Northern Ireland, there's a sea, but there's a sea to cross. Therefore, you can kind of control things a bit more. Whereas when it comes to Scotland, then there's an open border, and I don't think that would really, it'd be very difficult, I think. But I believe it will be a major bone of contention between Edinburgh and London, and no doubt Scottish nationalists will make as much as they can of the Brexit issue in order to advance their own agenda. But I mean, that's really a matter for the future.
Their desire to join the European Union, do you think that, I mean,
sorry?
Just the desire of the current devolved government in Scotland to maintain its relationship with the European Union?
Yeah, I mean, I think
that's happening?
I mean, I don't know whether, I mean, look, the European Union is a union of states, not of regions, and I don't know, I mean, I know the Scots have looked at other possibilities, and I think they will look for some kind of special relationship with the European Union, but whether it's achievable vis-a-vis the rest of Britain and whether it will be acceptable to the EU is an open question for me, but it's certainly going to be a topic for discussion in the future, and it's going to stir things up in Scotland just as it stirred things up in Northern Ireland, because both Scotland and Northern Ireland did vote to remain. In Northern Ireland, again, the division is probably 80% of nationalists voted to remain, but probably a minority of unionists voted to remain. So therefore, again, there's a division within the two communities in that the nationalists desperately want to remain, the unionists are more divided.
In one word, it's a mess.
It's a mess. Several messes.
Let me just say, unfortunately, we don't have as much time as we normally have, so we have a couple of questions and then we need to gradually come to an end. Yes, please. Yeah.
I'll wait for the mic.
So the month of July brought a lot of resignations within like the UK government, especially on the negotiation side with David Davis and Boris Johnson and such. Do you think their resignations have sort of helped Theresa May deliver the Brexit she's promised, and also in turn keep her job as well?
Well, that would be a political matter. It would be always unwise for a diplomat from another country to comment on the affairs of a neighbouring country. But obviously, Irish people have been watching what's happening in Britain, and what I said earlier is true. There's clearly a toxic political environment surrounding the European issue, and our hope would be that Prime Minister May manages to stick to the course she set with the Chequers Agreement, but it's going to be difficult for her, no doubt. And I think everyone can understand that she's kind of she is under attack.
Lost your mic.
Oh, sorry. Oh gosh. So I have.
No, it's there. It's just maybe on your head.
She's under attack from her some elements within her party who are really angry and feel that she's trying to sell out the whole Brexit process. I mean, in my view, she's simply trying to create a pragmatic, sensible version of Brexit that ought to be in everyone's interest. But the trouble is, when political passions are unleashed, it can become quite difficult to arrive at sensible, pragmatic compromises.
Thank you very much. Well, Pierre.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Very interesting perspective. I'd like to push you in a slightly different direction, maybe, about how your country views the future of the EU without Britain, but with governments that are clearly not committed to the same kind of open democratic institutions that Ireland is, and what impact that might have on this unity that you see as part of the EU, particularly after the upcoming elections and a new commission and lots of changes next year.
That's an extremely good question. The European Union is a political project, effectively. It's a treaty-based project, but ultimately it depends on the political will, not the will expressed by the people on a regular basis, but rather by the governments who meet within the European Council and the Council of Ministers. And my experience between 1978, when I joined the Foreign Service, and 2007, when I was last dealing directly with European Union affairs, has been that the governments of the member states were all on the same page, and therefore they could reach agreements. And even though I remember a few occasions when agreement looked impossible. For example, when every 5 years we have to negotiate the budget for the following 5 years, it's usually an impossible situation. But in the end, it sort of works out because countries are more or less trying to be helpful and trying to be constructive. It is the case at the moment that there are countries who do not buy into the old consensus that was so powerful in keeping the European Union together. And the countries that are still committed to that consensus, and they're still the majority, the big majority within the European Union, simply have to find ways of making sure that the traditions, the best traditions of the Union, are not undermined by cavalier behaviour on the part of governments. But it won't be easy. I think an interesting time coming up now will be the negotiations on the next budget, which will start next year. And that's going to give rise to all sorts of discussions about whether you make structural funds, in other words, European transfers to various countries, contingent on the maintenance of proper democratic standards and so forth. And that could be a point of leverage. The other thing I would say, of course, is that nothing is forever. And I can remember times when the European Union had governments of all different persuasions. I don't think we should assume that that the current disarray in the political world around Europe and indeed elsewhere will continue forever. It may be that we will see a return to more normal politics in the years ahead. I certainly hope so, because I believe that the European Union has been a project of the centre, and the centre has actually benefited both Europe and the United States greatly over the last 70 years, and to chuck that tradition out the window without knowing what will replace it would be a very foolhardy thing to do. So I appeal to Americans on a regular basis to continue to adhere to the values that have kept the European Union, kept Europe and North America so closely bound together for so many years, to the benefit of both of our societies.
This very optimistic note. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for a very stimulating and informative evening. Let me tell you that we are meeting again on the 25th of October, when a member of the Embassy of Azerbaijan will come to us and talk to us about Eurasian geopolitics, Russia and other countries. Thank you very much, and I hope you will be back.